Did Henry VIII want a divorce from his wife so he could have a hot, young trophy wife instead? Or was he simply trying to get into the Guinness Book of World Records as the monarch with the most wives? Was the reign of his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, most memorable for her defeat of the Spanish armadillo, or for having a lot fewer spouses than her father? I'm Professor Jerome Arkenberg, and I'll answer these and other questions right after this. Hi, Professor Art here, and I've been teaching a wide variety of history courses at colleges across this country for the past 30 years. In this video, I'm going to tell you all about the sad life of Mary, Queen of Scots, the start of religious persecution in Ireland, why Henry VIII turned England Protestant, how Queen Elizabeth kept England Protestant, and how a Scottish king managed to take over England. At the end, I'll have the wrap-up quote on this video. But first, make sure to click like, share, and subscribe, and that little bell thingy, so I can continue to bring you more great videos just like this one. The Reformation began in England with the reign of Henry VIII, who took power in 1509 and managed to stay alive until 1547. He began as a staunch defender of Catholicism, fighting on the side of the Holy League against France in the War of 1511 to 1520, and writing a pamphlet against Luther, which earned him the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope in 1521, which his successors to the present day continue to bear as part of their official title. But the Pope's opposition to Henry's divorce of his wife, Catherine of Aragon, well, primarily Kate of Aragon, was the Emperor Charles V's aunt. Now, supposedly, the idea is that she was unable to give Henry a son. Now, keep in mind, the War of the Roses was still a living memory, and all in England were afraid of new civil wars if Henry left only a daughter as his heir, where the men, the nobility of England, might fight each other to be her wife. And of course, nobody back then knew anything about genetics, that the failure to have a son was really Henry's, but okay. Why doesn't the Pope simply give him, again, a divorce? Well, the Pope, even though had had problems with the Emperor, he needed the Emperor to fight both the Turks and the Germans, and didn't want to alienate him. So as a result, he told Henry, no divorce for you. Just keep trying. And Henry, of course, would not take no for an answer, so he broke with the church in 1532 and established his own church, the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, and putting himself at its head. The first order of business as the head of his own church, Henry is now essentially Pope of the Anglican Church, was to divorce his wife and marry his longtime lover, Anne Boleyn, which led to the resignation and death of his chancellor, Sir Thomas More, who eventually is canonized by the church as St. Thomas More, one of the very few lawyers that we know of that are officially in heaven. Parliament then enshrined Henry's actions in the 1534 Act of Supremacy, making the monarch of England, no matter who it is, head of the Church of England. But at a price. The price was the dissolution of all their many monasteries and friaries and nunneries and convents, and the sale of their lands to the gentry and nobility. Henry didn't have any problem with dissolving the monasteries, but of course, he would prefer to take all that land for himself. The problem was that would make him so powerful that he could become a divine right ruler in England, and the English nobility really would have none of that. The involvement of Parliament in Henry's Reformation, combined with England already being a centralized bureaucratic state ever since really William the Conqueror. You can find out more about that in my history, my video all about the High Middle Ages. But the idea was that everyone in the kingdom, even the king, was subject to the common law. Nobody was above the law. This enabled Parliament to survive when other medieval representative bodies disappeared or lost their powers in this period. Now, Henry's Anglican Church was at first little different in ritual, custom, even dogma from Roman Catholicism, except that Henry was at its head. But under Henry's chief religious advisor from 1534, Thomas Cromwell, it turned much more Protestant. Cromwell had Henry issue an authorized vernacular Bible in English, which ensured that the laity, and actually we can figure this out, look at my lecture on medieval education, but by the end of the Middle Ages, at least half the population in England could read for themselves. Most of them could not write their own name, and there's a reason for that in the lecture on medieval education. Go find out about that. But this way, the lay person can read the Bible for themselves. And Bible study was always a major force producing religious dissent and discussion. The Reformation in England, however, was not without resistance. For in 1536, a mass movement of peasants, led by the gentry and nobility of northern England, erupted, called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which, however, was bloodily suppressed. In 1536, Anne Boleyn, who had given birth not to a son but a daughter, Henry's fault, of course, was executed for adultery. It was a great excuse. He needed to get rid of her. And Henry immediately, the next day in fact, married his new lover, Jane Seymour, who died giving birth to a son in 1537. Henry at last got lucky, in more ways than one. Henry would go on to marry thrice more. Anne of Cleves, his wife for 6 months. Henry took one look at Anne. He called her kind of a plain dumpling. The portrait apparently did her a good deal of justice. The portrait portrayed her as a lot prettier than she was in real life. Henry wouldn't have that. Catherine Howard, for whom he married between 1540 and 1542, another one executed for adultery. And finally, Catherine Parr, whom he married in 1543, who was the only one to outlive Henry. Henry was succeeded by his 10-year-old son, Ed VI, who had reigned from 1547 to 1553. Not terribly long. At first, Ed was controlled by his uncle, Ed Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. who was appointed regent in the midst of wars with France and England. Somerset tried to subdue the Scots by establishing garrisons in the southern and eastern parts of the country, which merely stiffened Scottish resistance and enticed them to unite their realm in personal union with France by marrying the heir to the Scottish throne, Mary, to the French heir, Francois II, which would have been England's worst nightmare. There are two big enemies surrounding them on both sides. Kind of like later Germany's, which you can see in my lecture on the unification of Germany. In the start of World War I, Germany's big fear, nightmare, France on one side, Russia on the other. In this case, it's France on one side, Scotland on the other. At home, radical Protestantism advanced under Somerset, whose 1547 Treasons Act proclaimed Catholicism both heresy and treason. Up to this point, Catholics were allowed to exist, were allowed to say Mass and worship, as long as they didn't try to overthrow the kingdom. But now they're all traitors. Followed by the Dissolution of Chantry's Act, and then in 1549 by the Celibacy Act, which allowed priests to marry, and the Act of Uniformity, giving Parliament control of both doctrine and all ceremonies of the Anglican Church. But when major rebellions broke out in the West Country and Norwich in 1549, Somerset fell from power and was executed by his successor, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Poor Ed, King Ed, had no control over seeing his uncle killed. Meanwhile, Dudley, who was not Dudley Do-Right, by the way, Dudley made a humiliating peace with the Scots and the French in order to restore order in England itself. In 1552, Dudley, or Northumberland as he's sometimes called, issued an authorized prayer book. This is the Book of Common Prayer, still in use by the Anglican, and in America, the Episcopalian Church, which was the successor to the Anglican Church. This changed the Mass into a communion service, replaced altars by communion tables, vestments with simple surplices, and transubstantiation, the idea that the body, that the bread and wine at the Mass or the service literally becomes the bread, the body and blood of Jesus, replaced transubstantiation by commemoration, that it's not literal, simply symbolic, all heavily influenced by Calvinism. Superseding a 1544 Act of Parliament that had defined the order of succession, Ed VI, really afraid of his sister, oldest sister Mary, who was a Catholic, becoming the queen. Instead, he designated his cousin, a Protestant lady, Jane Grey, who at age 16 had been forcibly married to the regent's son. And upon Edward's death, without children, the regent, the Duke of Northumberland, Dudley, proclaimed her Queen Jane. She was quite the accomplished young lady, knew 9 different languages, did not want to be queen. Unfortunately for both Jane and Northumberland, the mass of the gentry and nobility refused any continuance of the regent in power, and a mere 9 days into her reign, Queen Jane and the Duke of Northumberland were arrested and shortly afterwards executed. Queen for 9 days. Mary, according to the Act of Succession, then takes over. She is the oldest daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She took the throne aiming to return England to Catholicism, and really in many ways to avenge her mother. She would reign from 1553 to 1558. In January 1554, looking for a powerful Catholic ally, she married King Phil II of Spain. But he had to agree, as did she, on one condition, which was imposed by Parliament: that Phil could only reign and not rule, and hence that no foreigners, in other words, Spanish Catholics, would be appointed to office, that England could not be drawn into Phil's many wars against Mary's will, and that Mary's sister Elizabeth would inherit if Mary died without children, Mary being at this point rather old and really past childbearing age. So Phil does become King of England. He gets the title. The laws refer to him as Philip and Mary, but he does not rule. But it's okay with him. Things can always be changed, right? Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work out that way for him. Mary and the new Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, Reginald Cardinal Pole, brought the Counter-Reformation with them. And parliamentary acts in 1553 and 1555 abrogated all of our fathers and brothers' religious acts. However, the monasteries were not reestablished. Those lands had been sold and were far gone, and trying to get them back from the nobility would have indeed brought on a new uprising. Also, the church itself, the archbishops and the bishops, were unable to reclaim any of their lost lands for the same reason. But Mary, probably foolishly, revived the heresy laws, and ultimately 300 leading Protestants. Yes, only 300. If you read many of the books of the martyrs of Mary's reigns, calling her Bloody Mary, you'd think she had executed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Protestants, but in fact, it was only 300. And these were largely supporters of her father's divorce from her mother, essentially her mother's revenge. These were burned at the stake. But Mary, as I said, quite old by this time, past childbearing age, died after only 5 years, and her short reign kept England Protestant. Her successor was her younger sister, Elizabeth, who would reign until 1603, the daughter of Henry and Anne Boleyn. Now, Queen Liz was unwilling to marry and have her husband rule as king, which, by the way, depending on who she might have picked, might have led to a civil war anyway. But she was a very powerful woman, very intelligent, and really had no intention of having a man tell her what to do. She aimed through patronage of the arts to raise her prestige to such heights that none would think of overthrowing her, which becomes the first step on the road to divine right monarchy. This was the Elizabethan age, the golden age, that brought the Renaissance to England. A bit late, because the Renaissance is really over by 1500, but okay. So, art, architecture, music, and literature flourish. And especially in literature, you get the wonderful names of Sidney, Spenser, Marlowe, Johnson, Donne, Herbert, Kidd, Lilly, Fox, Hooker, Bacon, Burton, and of course, Shakespeare. She replaced her sister's Catholic ministers with moderate Protestants. She reissued the 1552 Book of Common Prayer. She removed Catholic bishops and clergy from office and put Protestants in their place. Bishops and archbishops still ruled. And reinstituted herself as supreme governor of the Church of England and defender of the faith. But Elizabeth increasingly had problems with the Puritans, who emphasized Bible study and independent religious thought, living godly lives under the direction of a learned preaching ministry in a church purged of all Catholic remnants. and the way the Church of England was set up, that was far too Catholic for these Puritans. Which meant, of course, it's subversive of royal authority, especially Queen Liz's authority, and she didn't want to have any of that. Now, in 1585, with Phil II in control of both Spain and Portugal, really the world's largest empire up to this point, and Phil firmly allied with France, Elizabeth sent troops to Holland in aid of the Dutch Revolt, which you can learn more about in my video all about the Dutch Revolt. This began a war with Spain that lasted 20 years, which was fought in France and Holland on both land and sea, in Ireland and the Caribbean, and in many ways was the start of the British Empire. The death of Liz without issue, no children of her own, led to the succession of James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and great-grandson of England's Henry VII. And, by the way, as we'll see in a few minutes, Liz had killed his mother, had her executed. But now, Jim VI of England will now rule in England as King Jim I. And you can find out more about King Jim in my lecture on the Civil War, Phase 1. Speaking of Scotland, the country began the period at war with England, when her king, Jim IV, here he is right here, was defeated and killed at Flodden Field in 1513, leaving the kingdom to his young son. King Jim V, in turn, died young when he too was killed when the English defeated his army at Solway Moss in 1542, leaving the kingdom to his infant daughter, Mary. In 1559, in pursuit of an alliance with France, the young Queen Mary and the young King of France, Francois II, were married. The two kingdoms united in personal union, so not administrative union. But unfortunately, the death of Francois II the next year, in 1560, spelled the end of the union, and Mary, by this point a Catholic, otherwise she couldn't have married the King of France, returned to a Scotland effectively ruled by the Calvinist preacher John Knox. In 1564, Mary married her cousin Lord Darnley, whom she really apparently loved, who was then murdered by the Earl of Bothwell in 1567, who then immediately forced the widowed queen to marry him, and he then declared himself King of Scotland. But these goings-on, and the fear of Mary's Catholicism, so upset John Knox and the Presbyterian Scots that at the end of 1567, Mary's brother, Lord Murray, forced Mary to abdicate in favor of her young son, Jim VI, while she herself was imprisoned. Well, hate to have to go to their holiday dinner. The next year, though, Mary escaped from captivity to supposed refuge with her cousin, Queen Liz, the Queen of England, who, however, immediately imprisoned her. And in 1587, after nearly 20 years in captivity, after she'd been implicated in several intrigues, Queen Liz had her executed. Of course, as I just said shortly before, in some ways, Queen Mary had her revenge on Liz, because after Liz died, Mary's son, who was raised as a good Protestant, Jim VI, took over England as King Jim I. And his successors reigned until well, the death of Queen Anne, though some would say Bonnie Prince Charlie, and any long story. And finally, we deal with Ireland. In 1529, Henry VIII, King of England, was also Lord of Ireland, but the English controlled only the Pale. This is a small area around Dublin, Dublin being here. Pale was pretty much the size of the red dot that you see here on my screen. The rest of the country was controlled by Anglo-Irish lords descended from the Norman invaders and Irish chieftains. The reign of Queen Liz of England saw the forcible imposition of English authority over all Ireland, with the Irish seen as little better than barbarians, even the Anglo-Irish, like, see here, Gerald Fitzgerald. While the English came to be more and more disliked by the Irish as nothing more than Protestant conquerors. These circumstances led to two major revolts in Ireland, from 1579 to 83 and 1593 to 1603, both of which involved papal and Spanish help, but both of which were suppressed. By the end of Liz's reign, the English had imposed political and military authority throughout Ireland, even though attempts to impose Protestantism were an utter failure, laying the roots for England's later Irish problems. The wrap-up quote: "These evil times trouble all good men's heads, and make their hearts ache, fearing that this barbarous treachery, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, will not cease in France, but will reach over unto us. To make safe the realm and our Queen Elizabeth, we must cut off the head of Mary, Queen of Scots, and guard the Queen strongly about with Protestants, and remove all Papist from the realm." Bishop Edwin Sandys of London in 1572. So, let me know what you think of this quote. Leave some comments in the section below. Also, what you liked about the video, and what other historical topics or subjects you'd like to see in future videos. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, as it will help me bring you more great videos. And make sure to click on that little bell thingy, so you'll know when the next History Waits for No One video is posted. If you want to know more, there are recommended studies on this topic in the description below, along with other ways to connect with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the past.